Matt Lau is an accomplished writer and analyst. He's trained in economics and financial analysis, and he's certainly one of my favorite columnists in the Financial Post. So, a warm welcome to you, my friend, Matt Lau.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, Matt, I'm really excited to have you as a guest because we're going to talk about very important issues related to the economy, issues that relate to the lives of Canadians. So, I want to ask you a really basic question. Why is the economy so foundational to our lives? To ask a dumb question.
Well, I mean, the economy is really just the way that we usually think about the economy, right, is the production of goods and services. And the standard of living is obviously a lot more than material things, but material things are, obviously a big part of anybody's quality of life. And the way that we usually measure, the quality of life in terms of economics, if you want to put a number on it, it's really GDP per capita, right? What is our economy producing in terms of goods and services, divided by the number of people in the economy. So, when we look at the GDP per capita in Canada, that's a figure that in past years has been slowing down, and that's a concern to a lot of people.
So, you have been watching this very closely over the years, Matt. What would you say is the general state of the Canadian economy?
Well, in terms of how the economy is growing, it's been very poor for a number of years now. And in fact, if you look at, say, from the third quarter of 2015 to the fourth quarter of 2023, which is the most recent data we have to date, but if you look at that time period, real GDP per capita in Canada is roughly flat. So, which means that the consumption of goods and services per person in Canada, or the ability to consume goods and services, measured by how much we're producing, has not really changed over this time period. While it's gone up by about 15% in the United States, just as a kind of benchmark. So, in terms of our quality of life and our standard of living measured in material terms, and what we have available to consume as a measure of, what our economy is producing, we've really done very poorly in the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so the last number of years, to sum up, our economy has been flat, stagnating, if you will. Those are my words.
Yeah.
And yet we've had challenges relative to affordability. Does that mean that we're kind of in that zone where it's referred to as stagflation? We have kind of the worst of both worlds. We have a stagnating economy, but also higher and higher prices.
The stagnation I referred to earlier was inflation adjusted, so growth in real GDP per capita. Now, the economy is growing, but a lot of that is driven by, for example, immigration. So it's not that, people are necessarily becoming richer. It's our economy is growing because there's more people in it. So certainly, we do have this affordability crisis, as you say. Costs are going up everywhere, and if you look at, especially if you look at certain areas where costs are going up, right? We tend to see it a lot in the service economy, or a lot of the areas. If you look at very long-term changes in prices of goods and services. It's a very interesting trend that the areas of the economy that have a lot more government regulation, or a lot more government involvement, tend to become more expensive over time as those sectors become less efficient and less productive.
So what would be an example of that, Matt?
Well, I think university tuition, the cost of university has, if you look at, say, the past 20 years versus the general inflation rate, it's gone much higher. Versus if you want to look at something where it has gotten much cheaper, let's say television and electronics, where the government has very little involvement. It's something where, the private sector is free to innovate and free to do things better, and free to reduce costs.
So that's a very powerful example. So if you had to step back a little bit in terms of your knowledge of both the Canadian economy and other economies that we compare to. Are there hallmarks within policy that enable a strong economy? Are there kind of the basics that you need to have in place to have a strong economy?
Well, policies are part of it. And one of the things that you will always notice about a strong economy and a quickly growing economy really is business investment. Because business investment is what allows people to be more productive, whether it's investments in machines, investments in equipment, in structures, in intellectual property. Um, and it's really this allowing people to be more productive that increases the goods and services that the economy will produce and that people will be able to consume. And in fact, so weak has been the business investment in Canada in the past 9 or 10 years that if you look at the capital stock adjusted for the number of workers, that in fact is even falling. So
So
I
those
think.
are big signs, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, when business does not feel confident investing, you really have to. There's really two pieces of this. First is what is wrong with the economy, or what is wrong with the policy environment that they don't feel confident investing. And the second piece is you see the results in the declining or the stagnating productivity and the stagnating standards of living.
Okay, so I think you've given a brilliant summation of how this is all interrelated. If you have the bad public policies, then that impacts the confidence, if you will, for business to invest in the economy, and that in turn affects our measure of productivity and ultimately our standard of living. But you have a debate, it seems to me, going on between what the government is prescribing as a solution to increase Canada's productivity and what others are saying, almost namely in the private sector. So, what do you think? What is the solution to this productivity challenge?
Yeah, well, I think they talked about the budget, dedicating billions of dollars to investment, and I think it's very important as to where investment comes from. Is it coming from the government or is it coming from the private sector? Now, I don't know why anyone would think that investment done by people who did not earn the money, to whom the money does not belong, and to whom do not get the rewards and benefits or feel the pain of the losses of whether their investments perform or not. Why would they invest it more prudently than the private sector, right? They have, politicians who are investing money, they did not earn the money, they have no skin in the game as to whether their investments are actually productivity increasing or not. If you look at economies across the world, I don't think you can point to an example where you have a high degree of government control or a high degree of government allocation of the resources in a certain sector and say that has resulted in better innovation and better productivity. It's always the opposite.
No, I like the way you think, Matt. Why would government be able to improve productivity when they're really the problem? And they don't have, as you said, skin in the game. So it's better that they get out of the way, lower the regulations, lower the taxes, and stop the political slide down the productivity train. So this is important because it does relate to standard of living. So, what is the difference between productivity versus our standard of living? Is there an easy answer to that?
Well, I mean, they're not exactly the same. I would say that productivity drives the standard of living, insofar as productivity enables us to get more from our labor, right? So it will increase the amount of goods and services that we can consume. And it's this consumption of goods and services, whether it's shelter or food or getting, a new vehicle or appliances, that is what contributes to our standard of living. So the two things are very closely linked.
So, speaking of standard of living and income, I thought it was fascinating within that clip, and certainly there's been many other reports on this, is the declining relative income of Canadian jurisdictions, including in this case the province of Ontario was mentioned, to various U.S. states. And I think, if memory serves me correctly, the the point was made that Ontario now average families make the same as the state of Alabama, which I think a lot of Canadians would look down on and say, I can't believe that we're earning the same amount as a southern state like that. Does that surprise you?
No, well, I mean, if you look at the numbers over the past, the past decade or so, as I said, the United States has just grown much more quickly than us. We've been a very substantial laggard when you look at Canada versus other jurisdictions. So the both in terms of GDP and also in terms of business investment. So, the tools that our workers have to make the economy more productive. That's the gap between us and the United States. We're also falling much further behind there. So it's both gotten worse in the past 5 to 10 years, but also the trend is downwards.
And this is a significant gap for, depending on where you live, that could be a difference of $15,000 to $20,000 per difference. It looks pretty dismal where Canada's standard of living is headed. Is that fair, Matt?
It is dismal. Now, we're not actually in a depression. A depression, you would expect to see a very, deep drop and no recovery at all. We're more in a
Yeah.
stagnation. We're not growing in terms of as I said, real GDP per capita has barely budged since, the last 8 or 9 years. It's not a depression, but it's certainly not very good news either, especially when you see other jurisdictions as was pointed out in the clip, and as I said earlier, like the United States, growing by about 15% in the same time period, right? The other way of looking at it is if we tracked with the United States over the last 8 to 9 years, we would have a 15% larger economy and a higher standard of living. And instead, we're you know, uh, again, flat versus 8 or 9 years ago. And actually, it's been for 6 or 7 quarters going downwards.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.